It was a crisp autumn evening in North Carolina in 1978. The air was cool, and the rustling of leaves was the only sound as the wind whipped through the towering trees of the Blue Ridge Parkway. The mountains stood in eerie silence, their peaks veiled in mist. For Harold, a seasoned truck driver, this wasn't his first time navigating these remote and winding roads. The route was familiar, and as usual, it was a peaceful evening with hardly any traffic. He had just finished a long haul, and the quiet of the night felt like a welcome break after the chaos of the road. The truck's headlights sliced through the thick fog ahead, and he found himself alone on the highway. As he neared a particularly secluded section of the parkway, Harold noticed a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light. His heart skipped a beat as he slowed down, unsure of whether it was a hitchhiker or some lost traveler. It was rare to see anyone on this stretch of road, especially at this hour. As he got closer, the figure became more distinct. A young woman, standing still by the guardrail, dressed in a pale white dress. The way she stood so motionless, almost ghostly, struck him as odd. She wasn't wearing a coat or any sort of outer clothing. Despite the chilly air that swept through the parkway, Harold couldn't help but feel uneasy as he approached. The woman glanced at him, and without hesitation, she made her way toward the truck. Her face was pale, almost as if she hadn't seen the sun in days. She was shivering, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and her lips were barely moving as she spoke. "Can you give me a ride? I'm not far from here, just a few miles up the road," she said in a soft voice. Harold could hear the quiet desperation in her tone. She introduced herself as Annie. "Sure, hop in," Harold replied, his unease growing but not wanting to leave her stranded in such a desolate place. Annie climbed into the passenger seat, and Harold continued down the road. The truck's engine hummed steadily as he steered the rig, trying to make small talk to ease the tension. But Annie wasn't much for conversation. She kept glancing nervously out the window, her eyes darting toward the dark woods. Every now and then she muttered something about a car accident. It was strange, Harold thought. She seemed almost as if she were in a daze, caught in the middle of a nightmare. They traveled in silence for a while, the only sound being the hum of the truck's tires against the asphalt. Harold stole a glance at Annie as she sat quietly, her face pale under the dim light of the truck's interior. It was clear that she was lost in her own thoughts, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods on both sides of the parkway were dense, and the darkness beyond them seemed to close in, making Harold feel uneasy. Eventually, they came upon a small house tucked away on the side of the road. The porch light flickered softly in the distance. Annie suddenly spoke up, her voice almost a whisper. "This is it. You can drop me off here." She gave him a weak smile, and Harold brought the truck to a stop in front of the house. He turned to her, ready to wish her well, but when he looked over, the seat beside him was empty. He could have sworn he had just heard her voice moments earlier, but now there was nothing but the emptiness of the truck. His pulse quickened as he looked around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Confused, Harold opened the door and stepped out, glancing around the yard. The house was quiet, and the night air felt colder than before. Where had she gone? He couldn't understand how she could have disappeared so quickly. He hesitated for a moment, then walked up to the door and knocked. An elderly woman opened it slowly, a tired but kind expression on her face. Her eyes softened as she saw Harold standing there, looking bewildered. "You must have met my daughter," the woman said with a heavy sigh. Her voice was filled with a quiet sadness. "Her name was Annie. She died 10 years ago on this road." Harold's heart sank. The elderly woman continued. "People still see her on cold nights like this, asking for a ride home. It's like she's trapped here forever waiting for someone to help her." A chill ran down Harold's spine as the woman's words echoed in his mind. He suddenly felt a weight in the pit of his stomach, realizing that the young woman he had picked up was no ordinary hitchhiker. Since that night, Harold couldn't shake the memory of the mysterious woman in white. In the years that followed, he would hear rumors from other truck drivers, many of them telling stories of a woman who appeared by the same bend on Blue Ridge Parkway. She would stand on the side of the road, dressed in white, asking for rides, but always vanishing without a trace once she had been picked up. The stories from the other drivers were chillingly similar, and each of them mentioned how they, too, had felt an overwhelming sense of dread as soon as they noticed her. No one dared stop anymore. The once peaceful stretch of road had become a place of fear, where the souls of the lost and the tragic roamed. And so, the legend of the vanishing hitchhiker of Blue Ridge Parkway grew, a tale passed down among locals and travelers alike, each retelling it with a sense of unease. Drivers who passed through that part of North Carolina at night still reported strange sights. The eerie figure of a woman standing on the side of the road, waiting for someone to give her a ride, knowing full well that anyone who did would never see her again. In 1964, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie orange hue over the stretch of Route 66 that ran through rural Oklahoma. The road, once the pride of America's highway system, now felt more like a forgotten relic, a haunted strip of asphalt traversed by few but the occasional weary traveler. It was on this quiet stretch of highway that two teenagers, Tom and Rachel, found themselves driving back from a dance at a local community hall, blissfully unaware of the horror that awaited them. Tom was behind the wheel of his old Chevy, a car that had seen better days, but it was enough to get them where they needed to go. Rachel, sitting beside him, was wearing a bright smile. The night had been a blur of music, laughter, and the carefree energy that only youth can provide. The two of them were still riding the high of the evening, not yet ready to head home. They joked and laughed, recounting moments from the dance, oblivious to the fact that their carefree night was about to take a dark turn. As they cruised down the road, they approached a bridge that spanned a small creek, an old rickety structure that had been there for decades. Local legend had it that the bridge was haunted, cursed by a tragedy that had occurred many years ago. The stories had been passed down by older generations, but to Tom and Rachel it was just another tale, another piece of folklore with no grounding in reality. It was just a bridge they had crossed many times before. But on this night, something felt different. Tom's car sputtered and coughed, and with a slight jolt it came to a complete stop. The engine had stalled, and no matter how much he tried, it wouldn't restart. The cold, dry air began to seep into the car, and the two teenagers exchanged glances. It wasn't a particularly rural stretch of road, but there wasn't a single house in sight. Rachel looked at him, her face palling a little. "Maybe we should get out and check it," she suggested, but Tom was already out of the car, popping the hood and trying to figure out what went wrong. Minutes passed, and still, there was no sign of movement. Rachel remained in the car, unsure whether to call for help or wait for Tom to return. She stared out at the dark woods, hearing only the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through the trees. She glanced nervously toward the old bridge ahead of them, its wooden planks creaking in the breeze. The night was becoming unsettlingly quiet. Time seemed to drag on, and Rachel's patience wore thin. She had no idea why Tom had been gone for so long. Anxiety gnawed at her as she sat alone in the car, the silence pressing down on her. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, she opened the door and stepped out, her shoes tapping lightly on the gravel as she walked toward the bridge. The air was colder now, and as she neared the bridge a strange feeling washed over her. It wasn't just a chill. It was a sense of something being wrong, something out of place. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the distance, heavy and deliberate. Rachel's heart began to race. She turned back toward the car, but before she could make her way back, she froze in her tracks. There, on the bridge's edge, stood a shadowy figure. The man was dressed in dark clothes, and his face was hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. He stood completely still, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't moving, just staring. His presence was unnerving, and Rachel's stomach twisted into knots. She had no idea who he was or what he was doing out there. There was something about the way he stood there, unnervingly silent, that made her feel like a prey being watched by a predator. The moment she locked eyes with him, she felt the air grow thick with tension. It was as if the world around her had gone still. She could hear nothing but the rhythmic pounding of her own heart. "Tom," she called out hesitantly, but the man didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. Rachel felt a chill run through her as the man's gaze remained fixed on her, unblinking. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, but she couldn't move. And then, she heard it drip, drip, drip. The sound was soft at first, faint but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the bridge. Rachel's gaze flickered to the dark space beneath the bridge, where the water flowed slowly. The sound of dripping water echoed, but it didn't sound natural. The rhythmic dripping seemed to grow louder with each passing second. Suddenly, the man moved. He took a slow step forward, his boots making a sound that seemed far too loud in the eerie silence. Rachel's eyes darted to the car, then back to the man. Drip, drip. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw what the man was holding in his hand, a long, shiny object, glistening in the dim light. It was a knife, dark with something that shimmered red in the moonlight, and before she could react, he spoke. "Are you alone?" His voice was low, deep, and menacing. "I am looking for my friend," Rachel stammered, backing away. She didn't know what to do, but her instincts screamed at her to run. The man's silence was deafening as he took another step forward. The dripping sound grew louder, echoing in her ears like a warning. She turned and ran back to the car, calling for Tom as she went. but by the time she reached the Chevy she was gasping for breath, and the man had vanished into the night. Rachel climbed into the car and locked the door, her mind racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel the terror rising in her chest. Minutes passed, and she still didn't hear from Tom. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. Her heart was pounding, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She had no idea where he had gone or if he was even still alive. Just as she was about to call out for him again, she saw something that made her stomach drop. Tom's body was hanging from the bridge, swaying slightly in the breeze. Blood dripped from his neck, and it fell onto the roof of the car, staining the metal with dark red droplets. Rachel screamed. The next morning, police officers found Rachel sitting in shock beside the car. She was too numb to speak, too terrified to move. She had witnessed something beyond comprehension. The police never found the killer, and the case went cold. They could never figure out who had murdered Tom, or why he had been killed in such a brutal way. To this day, the bloody bridge remains an infamous landmark along Route 66. Travelers who pass by report hearing the same drip, drip, drip sound, followed by the chilling sensation that they're being watched. Some say that the bridge is cursed, and that anyone who dares to stop there after midnight will encounter the spirits of those who died there. The locals avoid the bridge at all costs, and those who venture near it are often greeted by a sense of dread that's impossible to shake, and no one dares to cross it at night. The tale of Tom and Rachel, of the bloody bridge, lives on, a haunting reminder of what lurks in the dark corners of Route 66. Nevada's Highway 375, famously known as the Extraterrestrial Highway, stretches through an isolated part of the state, where the skies are often filled with a soft hum of distant secrets, a place where the moonlight illuminates the desert in a strange, almost unnatural glow. This highway is no stranger to oddities, strange lights, and sightings that even the most open-minded skeptic would find hard to explain. But it was the events of July 12, 2003, that would make one couple's trip down this highway the stuff of nightmares. Mark and Julie Sanders were a young couple, adventurous and full of life. They had driven out to Rachel, Nevada for a weekend getaway. Rachel, a small, quirky town, is nestled deep in the Nevada desert, and while it was famous for its proximity to the mysterious Area 51, the couple had no interest in extraterrestrials. They were simply there for the quiet, the peace, and the long stretches of open road. It had been a beautiful evening. The sun had set, and the desert was bathed in the soft twilight of dusk. The stars began to reveal themselves in the sky, and the night was cool, the perfect temperature for a drive. Mark and Julie were heading back toward Rachel from a visit to one of the nearby ghost towns, their car humming along the highway. There wasn't another soul in sight. The night felt surreal in its quiet, the only sound being the steady whir of their car's tires on the pavement. As they drove, Mark noticed something unusual in the distance, a set of headlights approaching at an alarming speed. He frowned and checked his rearview mirror. There was nothing behind them, so he dismissed the thought. The headlights grew closer, and as the SUV appeared from the darkness, Mark could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The vehicle was moving far too fast for a place like this, where people rarely ventured after dark. Mark, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his chest, kept his eyes on the road, but the SUV was relentless, tailgating them with its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. "Julie, do you see that?" Mark asked, his voice tight with concern. Julie, who had been enjoying the view, turned to look. "Yeah, what the hell is he doing? There's no reason for him to be so close." The SUV stayed on their tail, dangerously close, and it wasn't long before the driver of the other vehicle began to flash their headlights repeatedly. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the SUV swerved violently, overtaking them at an incredible speed. It shot ahead into the distance, leaving Mark and Julie in a daze. They both exchanged a confused look. "What was that about?" Julie asked, trying to laugh it off, but Mark remained silent, his mind racing. Before they could process what had just happened, the SUV reappeared, but this time it wasn't behind them. It was heading straight toward them at full speed. Mark swerved quickly, barely avoiding a head-on collision. The car slid off the road, the tires skidding in the gravel and sand. The next thing Mark knew, their car came to a screeching halt, sinking into the soft sand on the side of the highway. He glanced around, his heart pounding, but the SUV was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing but the empty stretch of highway, the desert, and the oppressive stillness of the night. "Mark, what the hell just happened?" Julie's voice trembled, her face paled from the shock. "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice tight. But that was no ordinary driver. They sat there for a moment, in stunned silence, trying to gather themselves. The silence was broken only by the occasional gust of wind blowing across the barren landscape. It felt like time had stopped. "Maybe we should call the police," Julie suggested, but Mark was already reaching for his phone. "No signal," he said grimly, checking his screen. The phone was useless in this isolated stretch of desert. Julie shivered. "We need to get out of here, Mark." He nodded, his instincts telling him that they were in danger, that they needed to leave this spot as quickly as possible. But before he could start the car again, the unmistakable sound of an engine roared in the distance. The black SUV reappeared, but this time it wasn't just driving on the road, it was heading directly toward them. Fast. Mark's eyes widened in fear. He started the car, his hands shaking as he tried to reverse, but the SUV was closing in with terrifying speed. "Go, go!" Julie screamed, clutching the door handle, her heart racing. Mark slammed his foot on the accelerator, but the car wouldn't move. The sand was too deep. They were stuck. The SUV was getting closer, its headlights blinding and relentless. Mark and Julie locked eyes in silent panic as the car drew nearer. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the black SUV vanished into thin air. One moment it was charging toward them, and the next it was simply gone. The road was empty again. The night was still. Julie was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "Did you see that? It had vanished." "I know," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. What the hell was that? Before they could process what had just happened, Mark turned to glance at the dashboard, but his heart nearly stopped when he saw something that chilled him to the core. His dashcam had recorded the entire incident, but when he went to check the footage, there was something even more terrifying. The video showed the black SUV appearing for just a split second, before flickering out like static on a television screen. It wasn't just the SUV that disappeared, everything about it, including the tire tracks and even the faint outline of the vehicle in the distance, had vanished. The desert sands were undisturbed. There were no signs of its presence. Mark quickly checked the back of the car. There was nothing unusual. It was as if the SUV had never been there at all. They called the police when they managed to get a signal, but the officers found nothing. The SUV was gone. The evidence was gone. Even the tire tracks Mark had expected to find were nowhere to be seen. The area had been empty for hours, with no trace of the black SUV ever being there. Mark and Julie continued their drive into Rachel, but the eerie feeling didn't fade. It lingered, following them through the night. To this day, Highway 375 remains shrouded in mystery. Drivers continue to report sightings of the phantom black SUV, tailgating them through the desert, flashing its headlights before vanishing without a trace. Some say that those who try to follow it never return. The story of Mark and Julie Sanders has become just another chapter in the strange, unsettling history of the extraterrestrial highway. A reminder that there are things in the desert, things that should never be chased, things that vanish, and things that are never truly gone.